This week's parsha, Parshas Masei, after the recounting of the travels of the Bnei Yisrael in the BaMidbar, the pasuk says, "Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe." Hashem spoke to Moshe, and he said, "Daber al Bnei Yisrael, say to the Bnei Yisrael, v'amart aleichem, tell them, ki atem ovrim es hayarden al eretz Canaan. You are crossing the Jordan into Eretz Canaan. V'hayrashtem es kol yoshvei ha'aretz v'pnechem. You shall conquer all the inhabitants of the land." And it says, "V'hayrashtem es ha'aretz v'yishaftem bo." You shall conquer the land and live therein. The sheet of the Ramban and Chumash, and the Ramban and the Sefer HaMitzvahs, is that this is a mitzvah saseh. It's a mitzvah saseh in the 613 mitzvahs to conquer and to live in Eretz Yisrael. We know that the Ramban wrote hasagas. He wrote comments on the Rambam's minyan mitzvahs. The Rambam does not count conquering Eretz Yisrael, Yeshiva Eretz Yisrael, as one of the 613 mitzvahs. And the Ramban, in his listing of mitzvahs that the Rambam omits, does count it. It's actually the fourth. The fourth mitzvah saseh that the Ramban adds is the mitzvah saseh shenetztavinu l'reshes ha'aretz, that we're commanded to conquer the land. And the Achrayim are troubled that it seems to be an explicit verse. The Ramban learns it from the pasuk in our parsha, "V'hayrashtem es ha'aretz v'yishaftem bo." So the question is, why does the Rambam leave it out? So the Achrayim give various solutions to the problem. The Satmar Rebbe in the Sefer Vayol Moshe has a long mimer on the mitzvah of Yeshiva Eretz Yisrael, and he writes in paragraph Hey that he doesn't understand why the Achrayim are troubled as to pshat in the Rambam. If you look at the Ramban himself in Chumash, the Ramban himself in Chumash quotes Rashi that doesn't understand the pasuk as meaning a command. It's a haftacha, it's a promise that if you occupy the land, then you will be able to live in it. It's not a mitzvah, it's a haftacha. And the Ramban argues in Rashi. The Ramban says, "Mashi pirashnu hu ha'eker," that my pshat, that it's a mitzvah saseh, is the correct pshat. But Rashi, he brings Rashi who disagrees. The Arachayim actually brings the Ramban and Rashi, and the Arachayim shows from the pasuk, from the wording of the pasuk, we'll see his proof in a moment, that really Rashi's pshat is more correct than the Ramban's pshat. So what is the kasha that the Achrayim are bothered by? Now the Ramban himself acknowledges that there are two pshatim in the pasuk. His pshat that it's a mitzvah, and Rashi's pshat that it's not a mitzvah. So there's a kasha in the Rambam holds like Rashi. Like the Achrayim struggle to answer the Rambam, why the Rambam omits this mitzvah. He learned the pasuk like Rashi. The Ramban argues. The Ramban says his pshat is correct. The Rambam will say that Rashi's pshat is correct. It's hard to understand what the issue is. This is what the Satmar Rav says. In the family is daiti. I'm not worthy of arguing with Satmar Rav, but if you examine the Ramban carefully, and the Rashi carefully, and the Arachayim carefully, you'll see that the kasha and the Rambam is still problematic. In other words, that saying that the Rambam learned like Rashi does not solve the problem. You look at the Ramban in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, it's clear from the Ramban that the Ramban holds that this mitzvah has two different aspects to it. Even though in the minyan HaMitzvahs is counted as one mitzvah, there are two different aspects to this mitzvah. The Ramban writes as follows. It says, mitzvah revius, the fourth mitzvah that the Rambam omits, is shenitztavinu loreshes ha'aretz asher nosan hakel yizbarach v'yisalal aviseinu lavrom liyitzchak u'yaakov. We are commanded to conquer the land which Hashem, blessed be He, gave to our forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, V'Yaakov. V'lo nazva v'yad zulaseinu. We should not leave it in anybody else's hands. If the 7 nations are occupying the land, we can't leave it in their hands. Nor can we leave it empty. In other words, to conquer the land, Loreshes means to possess the land. So to possess the land means to drive out the current occupants and to possess it. Because if we would drive them out and then abandon it, that also wouldn't be Loreshes. So we are not allowed to leave it in the hands of an occupying nation. We're not allowed to leave it abandoned, because we are obligated to conquer it from its current occupants and be in possession of it. And the Ramban brings many psukim to demonstrate this fact. And then, way at the end, the Ramban adds something. And he says, V'aymer ani, and I say, Ki ha-mitzvah she'achachamim mafligim, the mitzvah which the Rabbanon expand upon, V'hidiras Eretz Yisrael, and that is the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, not the mitzvah of conquering Eretz Yisrael or possessing Eretz Yisrael, but the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, Ad she'amru, to the extent that they said that if a person leaves Eretz Yisrael and lives in Chutz La'aretz, he's like an idolater. Hu mi mitzvah saseh hazeh. It also comes from this mitzvah saseh, because it says in the pasuk, Loreshes ha'aretz u'lasheves ba. It says we have to possess the land and we have to live in the land. Im kain, if so, he mitzvah saseh l'doros. So this is a mitzvah for eternity. Mischayev kol yachid mimenu, and every individual Jew is therefore obligated. Va'afilu bizman galus, even in the time of galus. Ki yadua b'talmud b'mokemes harbe, as is well known from the Gemara. So what is the Ramban saying? The Ramban is saying there are 2 different aspects to this mitzvah. The first aspect of the mitzvah is that Klal Yisrael, as a nation, should conquer the land and take possession of the land. This is a mitzvah which is mutalas ala tzibur. This is a communal mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah on an individual. No individual can conquer a land. This is a mitzvah on the nation to conquer the land and possess the land. Then there's another mitzvah, that every individual is mechuyev to live in Eretz Yisrael. And all the wonderful things that Chazal tell us about living in Eretz Yisrael, what a great schus it is, what a privilege it is, all comes from this mitzvah saseh. And that's what Ramban seems to learn in the pasuk, because the pasuk has 2 phrases. It says, "V'hayrashtem es haaretz, v'yeshavtem ba." You shall possess the land and you shall live in it. These are 2 separate aspects of the mitzvah. We count it as one mitzvah in the 613 calculation. But there are really 2 different facets to this mitzvah. The first is the communal mitzvah, to conquer the land and take possession. And the second is the individual mitzvah, which is on every yachid, every individual, to live in Eretz Yisrael. 2 different mitzvahs. And therefore the Ramban says, again, that all the Gemaras that say such wonderful things about living in Eretz Yisrael really are based on this second aspect, which is the mitzvah of individuals to live there. Comes Rashi, and Rashi says that the v'yeshavtem ba is not a mitzvah, it's a promise. And this is how Rashi says. Rashi says, "V'hayrashtem es haaretz, v'hayrashtem eisam miyeshveha." You shall conquer it from its inhabitants, v'oz yeshavtem ba, and then you'll live in it. Tuchlu l'kayim ba. V'im lav, if you don't do a good job conquering the land, then you won't be able to stay there. In other words, if you think you can live in Eretz Yisrael without conquering it, it's not going to work. Because if you try to live there just keep under the radar, you're not going to be successful. You have to conquer the land, and then you can live there. But it's not a mitzvah saseh to live there, it's a promise. If you conquer the land, then you will live there. Comes the Darchei, and he explains the machlokas this way. Rashi Pirish, Rashi says, Sheha mitzvah hi v'hayrashtem. The mitzvah is to conquer the land. Above v'yeshavtem, but v'yeshavtem is a haftacha, is a promise. The Ramban's al Pirish, the Ramban says, Shamitzvah hi v'yashavtem. In other words, everyone agrees, even Rashi agrees, that there's a mitzvah saseh in this pasuk. Rashi holds the mitzvah saseh of this pasuk is the communal mitzvah to conquer the land. The v'yashavtem is a haftach, that if you fulfill the communal mitzvah of conquering the land, then you will successfully live there as individuals. But the living there as an individual, according to Rashi, is not a mitzvah saseh. It's a haftach, that if you fulfill the mitzvah of conquering the land, then you will be able to live there successfully as an individual. The Ramban argues, and the Ramban says, no, there are two mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah to conquer the land, which is a mitzvah of the tzibur, and there's a mitzvah to live there, which is a mitzvah on individuals. But both Rashi and the Ramban agree that there's a mitzvah to say in this pasuk. So to say that the Rambam holds like Rashi won't solve anything, because everyone agrees there's a mitzvah saseh in this pasuk. The only question is, what is the mitzvah saseh? Is there only one aspect to conquer the land? Or is there a second aspect as well to live in the land? So that's the machlokas. But everyone says there's a mitzvah saseh. Why doesn't the Rambam cite that? So what the Satan Rebbe says that what is troubling all the Achronim? Why didn't you just say the Rambam held like Rashi? Is not correct l'chayra. Whereas Rashi also agrees there's a mitzvah saseh. He doesn't define the mitzvah saseh as the Ramban defines it. According to the Ramban, there are two aspects. According to Rashi, there's only the one aspect of the communal mitzvah. But at least count that as a mitzvah. We would have to say, to answer the Rambam, the following. And this is really a little bit merumas in the Ramban himself. That mitzvah, the communal mitzvah, is not a mitzvah l'doros. That wasn't the mitzvah that was given to Klal Yisrael for eternity. That was a mitzvah that was given specifically to that generation, the generation that was going to cross the Yarden under Yeshua ben Nun. And the Rambam says a klal in the meaning of mitzvahs, that a mitzvah which is only lishah, a mitzvah which is only a temporary mitzvah, is not counted in the meaning of mitzvahs. The reason the Ramban counts it is because the Ramban holds there is a second mitzvah which is to live in Eretz Yisrael, and that is l'doros. And if you go back to the wording of the Ramban, it's almost explicit in the Ramban. The Ramban says, V'aymer ani, that there's a second mitzvah here, which is to live in the land, and he says, Im kain, if so, he mitzvah saseh l'doros. If so, it's a mitzvah for all generations. Mischayev kol yachid mimenu, every individual is obligated. So the Ramban seems to understand that the first mitzvah, the communal mitzvah, is not a mitzvah saseh l'doros. That was a one-time mitzvah that was given to that generation, the generation of the B'ai Ha'aretz under Yeshua to conquer the land. What makes this a permanent mitzvah is the mitzvah of living in the land. And therefore, according to Rashi, it's true there's a mitzvah in this pasuk, which is to conquer the land. But that mitzvah is a mitzvah l'shah. The mitzvah of living in the land, Rashi holds, is not from this pasuk. This pasuk is a haftacha. It's not a mitzvah. And therefore, the Stam Rebbe's teretz would therefore be correct. In other words, everyone agrees that the pasuk is a mitzvah saseh, but the part which is to conquer the land is a mitzvah l'shah, and that shouldn't be counted. The only thing that would be counted in the minyan is the mitzvah to live in the land, which is l'doros. So according to the Ramban, that is a mitzvah. According to Rashi, it's only a haftacha. The Rambam will hold like Rashi. So this will give the Mekayim with the Stam Rebbe answer. One of the kashas that is asked on the sheet of the Ramban, Achronim asks, is from the Gemara Masechah Saita. The Gemara Masechah Saita, that the Daled, asks a question. Darchei of Simloi. V'neiman nis'ava Moshe Rabbeinu likanos l'Eretz Yisrael. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu have such a desire to come into Eretz Yisrael? We know that Moshe Rabbeinu, he davened, that he begged the Rebbeinu Shloim to be allowed to come into Eretz Yisrael. How come? V'chilecho mipir Yehud tzarech. Did Moshe Rabbeinu need to eat the fruits of Eretz Yisrael? Or the Zebaya mituva Yehud tzarech? Do you need to be sated by the goodness of Eretz Yisrael? What was his interest in coming to Eretz Yisrael? Elakach Amar Moshe. So said Moshe Rabbeinu. Harbe mitzvahs nitztavu Yisrael. There are many mitzvahs that Jews are obligated to keep. They miskaimen ela be'eretz Yisrael, and they only can be fulfilled in Eretz Yisrael. The mitzvahs are tluyas ba'aretz. Echanas ani la'aretz. Let me come into Eretz Yisrael, k'dei sheyiskaimu kulin al yodi. In order that I should fulfill those mitzvahs, I should have the opportunity to do all those mitzvahs, trumas and maisras and shmita, and so on and so forth. So ask the Achronim, according to the Ramban, that living in Eretz Yisrael itself is a mitzvah saseh, so what's the kasha? Why did Moshe want to go in? He wanted to go in to fulfill the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. But the Bishlam like Rashi, that the V'yashaftim bo is a haftacha, but there is no mitzvah to live there as an individual. So okay, so why did Moshe want to go? Because there were other mitzvahs that could only be done in Eretz Yisrael. Truma, Meiser, Shemitah. But according to the Ramban, that just living in Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah. So what's the kasha? Why did he want to go? Of course he wanted to go. He wanted to fulfill the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. Like why did the Gemara say he wanted to fulfill the mitzvah of Truma, of Meiser, the many mitzvahs, the mitzvahs of Luyas Baras? There's a very simple reason why he wanted to go into Eretz Yisrael. To fulfill the mitzvah, the Ramban says, of living in Eretz Yisrael. Many Achronim asked this kasha on the Ramban. The Meshech Chachma, in the beginning of Parshas Re'eh, says a very interesting teretz to this kasha. It says like this. He says that the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael can be fulfilled in Eiver Hayarden too. That the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is not only on the west side of the Jordan. On the Eiver Hayarden, on the east side of the Jordan, the lands of Sichon and Oig that were occupied by the Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, as we read in this week's parsha. A person fulfills the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, living in those lands too. Says the Meshech Chachma, what's the proof? The proof is, because otherwise, how could the Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain have wanted to remain in Eiver Hayarden? They would be mevatel the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. So it must be, says the Meshech Chachma, it's davar pashut, that the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is not only on the west side of the Jordan, it's even on the east side of the Jordan, Eiver Hayarden. A person fulfills the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara couldn't say that Moshe wanted to cross the Yarden to fulfill the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. That mitzvah he already fulfilled living on the east side of the Yarden. So why did he want to cross? So says the Meshech Chachma, pshat in the Gemara very cleverly. Because the halacha is the mitzvahs of tluyas ba'aretz don't apply until after the 14 years of kibush v'chiluk. That the entire land has to be conquered and subdivided before the obligation of the mitzvahs of tluyas ba'aretz begins. And it's interesting, the Gemara says that it took 7 years to conquer the land, it took 7 years to divide the land. It was already conquered. It took 7 years to divide the land, but that is a necessary condition. The mitzvahs of tluyas ba'aretz only apply after the kibush v'chiluk. And therefore, although Moshe Rabbeinu fulfilled the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael and Eiver Hayarden, but he didn't have the opportunity to do the mitzvahs of tluyas ba'aretz. Those would not be fulfilled until after the entire land was conquered and subdivided. And therefore, that's why he wanted to cross the Yarden. I mean, I will ask an irritating question that would have been a very simple solution. Let Moshe Rabbeinu remain in Eiver Hayarden for the 14 years. And then, when the entire Eretz Yisrael was conquered and subdivided, there'd be an obligation of mitzvahs of tluyas ba'aretz and Eiver Hayarden too. And the problem is solved. Why would he have to cross the Yarden? So this question is, as I said, an irritation. It could be that Moshe Rabbeinu did not see an eitzah to stay in Eiver Hayarden, because historically, all the men, the Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, crossed the Yarden to assist in the conquest. Who stayed behind? Only the women and the children. So Moshe Rabbeinu was not going to remain behind alone, the only man, with all the women and children for 14 years. So that wasn't a solution. But this is how the Meshech Chachma understands Pshat in the Gemara. The mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael Moshe had already fulfilled. And the mitzvahs of Pluyas Baretz, for that he would have had to cross and wait for the 14 years of Kibush V'chiluk. That's the answer of the Meshech Chachma. In the footnote, in the editions, the 3-volume edition of the Meshech Chachma, the Magia, Rav Kuperman, brings a question on the Meshech Chachma from a friend of his. That this friend of his asked the question. The Meshech Chachma brings a raya that the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is fulfilled even in Eber HaYarden from the Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain. What's the proof? We know from the Parsha that the Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain crossed the Yarden and assisted in the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. So perhaps that's how they fulfilled their obligation. But Moshe Rabbeinu, who remained in Eber HaYarden, would not have fulfilled his obligation that way. That's the question that his friend asked. And Rav Kuperman seems to think this is a very, very strong question. The question is a mistake. Because as we saw from the Ramban, there are two different mitzvahs, two different aspects of the mitzvah of Yeshiva Eretz Yisrael according to the Ramban. There's the mitzvah to conquer the land, which is the communal mitzvah, and there's the mitzvah to live there as an individual. So Mabakach, so what? The Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain crossed the Yarden and assisted in the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. That's true. They were participants in the first half of the mitzvah. But if then they would go back to Eber HaYarden to live, they would be mavatal the second half of the mitzvah. So it must be that what the Meshech Chachma says is correct. That the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is fulfilled in Eber HaYarden. You can't say that, no. The mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is only fulfilled in the part of the land which is beyond the Jordan. But they went and they assisted in the conquest. Good, that's very nice. They assisted in the conquest. But if you move now to Chutz La'aretz, right, you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. So it's clear that the Meshech Chachma is correct. That the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is fulfilled in Eber HaYarden. But there nevertheless is a tremendous chidush in this Meshech Chachma. Because one might have thought that granted a person fulfills the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, even in Eber HaYarden, but that's only after the Kibush V'chiluk. After the conquest and after the division of the land, now that the land has Kedushas Haaretz, now you fulfill the mitzvah of living there. But before the Kibush V'chiluk, before the conquest, you fulfill the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael? Before it has Kedushas Haaretz? In other words, the Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, after they assisted in the conquest and subdivision of Eretz Yisrael, so now Eretz Yisrael is sanctified. So now they go back to Eber HaYarden and they live there, they fulfill the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. It has the Kedushas Haaretz, it has the mitzvah of Tluyas Baretz. That I understand. But to say that Moshe Rabbeinu fulfilled the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael before Eretz Yisrael was conquered, before it was Niskadesh, before the Kedushas Haaretz, before the mitzvahs of Tluyas Baretz were knowing, that's a tremendous chiddush. That's what the Meshech Chachma is saying. The Meshech Chachma is saying that Moshe Rabbeinu fulfilled the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael and Eber HaYarden even before the conquest of the land, before he could fulfill the mitzvah of Truma and Meiser and Shemitah. He was in compliance and he fulfilled the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. This is a tremendous chiddush. You see from here something that we discussed many, many years ago. Many years ago. Actually, the first year of the Shir in this base madrash goes back about almost 20 years ago. That there are really two aspects to Eretz Yisrael. There is the intrinsic kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, and there is the kedusha that Eretz Yisrael has because it is a Jewish possession. Because Eretz Yisrael is the possession of the Jewish people, so the kedusha of the Jewish people infuses Eretz Yisrael with additional sanctity. That's why the mitzvahs of Tluyas Ba'aretz, Truma, Meiser, Shemitah, only apply after the Kibush V'chiluk. Because after the land is conquered, and after the land is subdivided, and everyone is in full possession of his own portion, the land acquires an additional kedusha because it is the possession of the Jewish people. So in a sense, it's a consequence of the Kedushas Yisrael. The Kedusha of the nation infuses the land with additional Kedusha. And therefore, many of the mitzvahs of Kliyas Baretz only apply after the Kibush B'chiluk. But we know the Gemara says in Subas and Chafei that there's one mitzvah which applies in Eretz Yisrael before the Kibush B'chiluk, which is the mitzvah of Chala. The mitzvah of Chala applies even before the Kibush B'chiluk, Midaraisa in Eretz Yisrael. Which means that the mitzvah of Chala is not rooted in that aspect of the Kedusha which is a consequence of the conquest. It's rooted in an intrinsic quality in Eretz Yisrael for which Eretz Yisrael is holy. And therefore, even before Kibush B'chiluk, the mitzvah of Chala applies. Where do we point this out? We point this out on a very, very interesting machlokes between the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra in Parshas Chayei Sarah. Very interesting machlokes. That the Torah is very myrich on Avraham Avinu's negotiations to buy the Maras Machpelah. The question is why. So the Ibn Ezra says that it was written to teach us the Maila, the benefit of burial in Eretz Yisrael. That Avraham Avinu worked so hard to bury Sarah in Eretz Yisrael. You see that Eretz Yisrael has a Maila for burial. The Gemara says if a person is buried in Eretz Yisrael, all the person's Averos are forgiven. It says in the pasuk, "V'chiper ad maso amo," that the land atones for its people. So you see that burial in Eretz Yisrael is a very great thing, and you see that from Avraham Avinu. That's why Avraham Avinu worked so hard to purchase the Maras Machpelah. So the Ramban asks from the Ibn Ezra, what do you see? Like, what alternative does Avraham have? If Avraham would have brought Sarah from Chutz La'aretz to bury in Eretz Yisrael, you see the Maila of burial in Eretz Yisrael. He could have buried her in Chutz La'aretz. He brought it to Eretz Yisrael. You see the Maila of Eretz Yisrael. He says, but they were in Eretz Yisrael. So what should Avraham have done? What was the alternative? Like, how do you see from this entire story that there's a Maila of burial in Eretz Yisrael? That's the Ramban's question on the Ibn Ezra. So we pointed out that the issue is as follows: that the people offered Avram to bury Sarah in their gravesite. They said, you can bury her wherever you want. In our cemetery, the best grave, will let you bury her. And Avraham Avinu insisted, no, I want to buy the gravesite. I want it to be my possession. He says, why is that? Avraham had to bury Sarah. Why did he so insist that he should own the burial site? He says, they offered. You can bury her in our cemetery. Why did Avraham Avinu insist, no, I want to buy it? So the answer is, the Ibn Ezra understood that the Maila of Eretz Yisrael for Kvura is only because Eretz Yisrael is a Jewish possession. If Eretz Yisrael would not be a Jewish possession, it would not have that benefit of Kvura. And therefore that's why Avraham wanted to buy it. By buying the Maras Machpelah, so that Maras Machpelah was the possession of the Jewish people, meaning a possession of Avraham. Had he buried Sarah in the cemetery of the Bnei Ches, you wouldn't have had that benefit. And therefore now we see the Ibn Ezra makes perfect sense. He says, why did the Torah tell us this whole story of how he negotiated and the exorbitant price he paid? It's very simple. He says there was an alternative. He could have buried her in their cemetery, as they offered. But he said that no, it has to be my possession, because there's a mile of Eretz Yisrael which only can be had if it's a Jewish possession. And therefore, that's what the Torah is ma'arich to discuss the lengths that Avraham Avinu went to in order to make the Maras Machpelah a Jewish possession. Why does the Ramban argue? Because the Ramban holds that this mile of Eretz Yisrael for Kvura is not because it's a Jewish possession. It's part of the intrinsic mile of Eretz Yisrael. And because it's part of the intrinsic mile of Eretz Yisrael, then even if he would have buried her in their cemetery, it would have accomplished the same thing. And therefore there's no proof from the fact that Avraham Avinu wanted to buy the land. It has nothing to do with the mile of Kvur in Eretz Yisrael. But al Kalpanim, we showed then that the Ramban understands that this idea that Eretz Yisrael is beneficial for burial also is not rooted in the fact that Eretz Yisrael is the Jewish possession. It's rooted in the fact that it has an intrinsic kedusha. And therefore, hu hadin over here would be the same thing. That the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, holds Ramban, has nothing to do with the kibush. Even though the kibush v'chiluk did not yet take place, Moshe Rabbeinu fulfilled the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael in Ever HaYarden before the kibush v'chiluk, before the sanctity. That's what the Meshech Chochmah says. And this is a tremendous chidush. Just want to point out, I have an answer to this question. I just want to point out that l'chayra there is a stira to this from the Rishonim in the beginning of Maseches Gittin. That the pashtus of the Tosfos and the Ramban in the beginning of Maseches Gittin, there is a way out. It's a little bit complex, but I'll just point out the question. Seem to imply that the kibush is essential. See, the Mishnah says in Maseches Gittin, first Mishnah Maseches Gittin, that the cities of Akko and Ashkelon are in Chutz La'aretz. It's a Mishnah that Akko and Ashkelon are not part of Eretz Yisrael, they're in Chutz La'aretz. And the Rishonim ask a question that in Sefer Yeshua it says explicitly that Akko and Ashkelon are part of Eretz Yisrael. Part of Eretz Yisrael. So Tosfos initially wants to answer that the Gemara tells us an interesting thing. The Gemara says that the Eretz Yisrael which Yeshua conquered was much larger than the Eretz Yisrael that was conquered by the Oilei Bavel. When the Jews came back from the Golus Bavel, they conquered a much smaller area. Harbe krachum kivshum Oilei Mitzrayim v'lo kivshum Oilei Bavel. There were many lands that the Oilei Mitzrayim captured. When the Jews came with Yeshua, they conquered. And when the Yidden came back, time of Ezra, they didn't conquer such a large area. And the Gemara says those areas that were conquered by the Oilei Mitzrayim and not by the Oilei Bavel, the Gemara says those areas do not have Kedusha Sa'aretz. They don't have the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. Because the Kedusha Rishayna, the sanctification that was achieved by Yeshua, Kitchel L'Shaita V'lo Kitchel L'Asad Lavo. It only sanctified the land for as long as it remained in Jewish possession. But when the Jews were exiled, that Kedusha lapsed. The Kedusha of the Oilei Bavel was a permanent Kedusha, and therefore that smaller area remains sanctified even B'Zman Hazeh. What the difference is a lengthy discussion. But this the Gemara says, that the Kedusha of those territories that were captured by the Oilei Mitzrayim, not by the Oilei Bavel, do not have Kedusha Sa'aretz. So therefore that's what Tosfos wants to answer. That now everything is good. The Psukim in Yeshua, which say that Ashkelon and Akko are part of Eretz Yisrael, that's true. They were part of the lands conquered by Yeshua. But they weren't conquered by the Oilei Bavel, and therefore, that's why the Mishnah says they are considered Chutz La'aretz. Says Tosfos, says the Ramban, but you can't say that. You can't say that. Because it says in the Pasuk that, it says in the Gemara rather, that Rav Abba, who lived after the Churban Bayesheni, used to kiss the rocks of Akko. Menashe Kippur Akko, he would kiss the rocks of Akko. And the Gemara says that when the Chacham of Eretz Yisrael would accompany a traveler who was going back to Chutz La'aretz, he was going back to Bavel, they would only accompany him as far as Akko, because Aser Latzeis Me Eretz Yisrael Chutz La'aretz, because the Jew who lives in Eretz Yisrael is not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. So when they would escort the person on his way back, they would stop in Akko. So you see that Akko was part of Eretz Yisrael even after the Churban Bayesheni, certainly after the Golus Bavel. So therefore Tosfos and the Ramban resolve the questions differently. The question is what's the kasha? According to the Meshech Chochmah, Granted, those lands don't have the Kedusha Sa'aretz as far as Trumas and Maasros, because they weren't conquered by the Eilei Bavel, but they still are within the borders of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore they should be no worse than Eber HaYarden. Just like in Eber HaYarden, Moshe Rabbeinu fulfilled the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, even though there was no Kedusha for Trumas and Maasros. Because the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael was rooted in the intrinsic qualities of Eretz Yisrael, to say the same thing. That Ein Achinami, those lands have a din of Chutz La'aretz for Trumas and Maasros. But a person still fulfills the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore that far the Chacham were willing to go, and Rabbi kissed the land. And beyond that, he wasn't willing to go. Ksas Tzorachin on the Meshech Chacham, how will understand the Rishonim? I have an approach, but we'll leave that on the back burner for now. But Al Kolpanim, this is the tremendous answer that the Meshech Chacham gives. That it's true, for the mitzvahs of Tluyas Ba'aretz, the land is only Kadosh after the 14 years of the Kibush V'chiluk, but Moshe Rabbeinu, even before that, fulfilled the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, even in Eber HaYarden. Now the hour is late. I just want to go off on a little bit of a tangent. The Gemara in Saita says that Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to go into Eretz Yisrael, and the Gemara says, why? He wanted to do the mitzvah of Tluyas Ba'aretz. So what was the answer? What was Hashem's answer to him? So the Gemara says like this. Amalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to him, why do you want to go and do the mitzvahs? You only want to do it because you want to be rewarded for it. Right? Like, why do you want to do these mitzvahs? You want the schar. So, Mala ani olecha kilu asisem. I will consider it as if you did the mitzvahs. I'll give you the schar anyway. Shneimar, as it says, Lochein achalek lo berabim. I will give him a share among the many. That's atzumim yechalek sholo. And with the strong he will divide the spoils. Why? Tachas asher he'eron lomus nafshay. Because he was bold and willing to give up his life. So the pasuk seems to be referring, in context refers to Mashiach, that he'll receive much reward because he was Meiser Nefesh. So the Gemara applies this pasuk to Moshe Rabbeinu and says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I will give him all the reward for the mitzvahs of Tluyas Ba'aretz without his going in and performing them. So Marsha asks the obvious question. What is HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying? That Moshe Rabbeinu wants to do the mitzvahs in order to get the schar? We know that a person should never do mitzvahs for the sake of schar. The Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, "Al tiyu ka'avodim ha'mashamish mesarav ha'manas l'kabel pras." You shouldn't be like servants who serve the master for the sake of reward. If anybody fulfilled that dictum, it certainly was Moshe Rabbeinu. He didn't do the mitzvahs for the sake of reward. What's the good brother thing? You only want to do the mitzvahs for reward, so I'll give you the reward anyway. Well, Moshe Rabbeinu did mitzvahs ha'manas l'kabel pras, not shayach. So when I just mentioned the Reb Chaim of Volozhin, in the Sefer Ruach Hayim, on that Mishnah, says a pshat in this Gemara. Very beautiful pshat in this Gemara. And with his pshat explains the pasuk that the Gemara brings. We know from the Mekubalim, the Ramchal and others, that why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu make human beings? He made human beings in order to bestow his kindness upon them. Because it's miteva tov lahetiv, it's the nature of the Rebbeinu Shalom, because he's good, to want to bestow good. And therefore he wanted to create beings that can be rewarded for doing good deeds. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu set up the world in such a way that a person is first placed in the Olam Hazeh, and here he is challenged, he's given mitzvahs and obligations, and if he lives up to them, he earns his eternal bliss in the Olam Haba. That's the scheme of creation. So in reality, what is the Tachlis HaBriya? The Tachlis HaBriya is to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be rewarded. Not for me to have the pleasure of receiving reward, but to give the Ribono Shel Olam the nachas ruach that he has from giving reward. That's the tachlis. So really, a person should serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu al-manos l'kabel pras. A person should serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the sake of reward, not because I want the reward, but I want to give HaKadosh Baruch Hu the opportunity to have the satisfaction of giving the reward. Now, this obviously is a very fine line. In other words, if a person would come and say, "Oh, I'm doing the mitzvahs for reward, but not because I want the reward. I'm doing the mitzvahs because I want to give HaKadosh Baruch Hu the nachas ruach of giving me the reward." What's the test? What's the test? How could you know whether the person's intentions are pure or whether the person is just saying it, going through the motions? Says Reb Chaim Rosh, and the answer is like this. What if a person would be told the following? I'm going to give you a mitzvah. If you do the mitzvah, I'm going to give schar to somebody else. Not to you, to somebody else. Would you do the mitzvah? That's the acid test. Because if you're doing it because you want the reward, so I should do a mitzvah for someone else to be rewarded? That's crazy. Why should I do a mitzvah? He should get the reward. But if you're doing it to give HaKadosh Baruch Hu the satisfaction of being native, what difference does it make whether he'll do it for me or whether he'll do it for him? If my doing the mitzvah gives HaKadosh Baruch Hu the opportunity to be native, then of course I'll do it. I'll thereby give HaKadosh Baruch Hu nachas ruach. That was the darg of Moshe Rabbeinu. Because we know that throughout history, Moshe Rabbeinu was constantly meiser nefesh for Klal Yisrael. He was willing to give up everything of his own for the sake of Klal Yisrael. That meant that to Moshe Rabbeinu it wasn't important that Hashem would be native to him. It was important that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be native, let it be to others. And therefore, even when HaKadosh Baruch Hu offered Moshe Rabbeinu and he said, "Herach mimeni v'ashmideim, let me be and let me destroy them, ve'esa oschalu g'gadol, and I'll make you into a great nation," Moshe Rabbeinu said, "No, I don't want that. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in anything for myself." He was the un of mind. He was the most selfless person. He says, if I'm interested in the HaKadosh Baruch Hu being native, that's to give the HaKadosh Baruch Hu the nachas ruach, the satisfaction of being native. It doesn't have to be to me, it could be to them. Better it should be for them. And that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him, says Reb Chaim Rosh. He says, I know you're only asking for schar. Of course it's not schar for yourself. Of course Moshe Rabbeinu isn't doing it to earn schar for himself, for his own pleasure. He's doing it in order to give me the satisfaction of giving schar. So therefore I will give you the schar anyway. And that's the puzzle. Why? Because he was bold and willing to give up his own life. But it's because Moshe Rabbeinu was constantly willing to be meiser nefesh. That proves that the schar that he wanted was not for himself. For himself, he was willing to give up everything. It was only in order to give HaKadosh Baruch Hu the nachas ruach, the satisfaction of being native, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, that's a kosher kapana, and hareini ki'ilu es kabalti. I will consider it as if you did the mitzvahs, and I will give you that schar, and allow you to give me that nachas ruach, even without actually performing the mitzvah. So this is the very beautiful pshat that Reb Chaim Rosh says. And of course, this time of year, we're holding in the days between the Yeshiva Shabbat Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, and certainly all thoughts are turned somewhat to Eretz Yisrael and the Beis Hamikdash and the predicament of Galus, and we read these parshias, which really are the parshias that bring us to the threshold of Eretz Yisrael, Matot-Masei, Devarim, during the Bein HaMetzarim period. And of course we hope that Ribono Shel Olam should answer our tefillas, that B'Karaiv, it shouldn't just be that we read these things and study them in theory, but actually they will be fulfilled in actuality from Herav Yameinu.